So how about that last season of Game of Thrones? Yeah, I know, I'm late to the party. Not as late as I was last time, but yeah, I know. Season 8 sucked. We've all moved on. The latest seasons of Stranger Things and The Handmaid's Tale are out now, so no one fucking cares anymore. But I have things to say, and I figured I'd sit out the initial shitstorm since I'm one of those people who didn't totally hate the last season. It was fine. It was fine. It was totally fine. It was fine. It was fine. But anyway, I'll elaborate on my overall feelings a little bit later. Let's get on to defending things that suck. Now this was originally going to be a defense of the season as a whole, but that would be hard. Also, I'm trying to shorten these videos, so to that end, I'm going to tighten the focus a little. So what I'm going to talk about is what happened with Daenerys. Specifically, how she went from this to this. So first, let's pretend like we haven't all watched seasons 1 through 4 20 times and recap Dany's story. Oh, and don't forget to bring your jetpack. Time is short, so we're going to have to skip over some details. So in season 1, she has this asshole brother, Viserys, who sells her to a raping and pillaging warlord named Drogo in hopes that Viserys can use his army to win everyone's favorite chair. But of course, being an asshole, he pisses off Drogo, who very awesomely and brutally murders him by pouring molten gold over his head. Drogo then vows to use his army to win the pokey chair for his son, not Daenerys. It is through Drogo that Dany first learns to wield power, because before this she was completely powerless. It's not her power, but she can wield some of Drogo's. So when Drogo dies, she almost becomes powerless again, so she takes a giant risk and basically does some makeshift blood magic to birth 3 dragons, and it was fucking awesome, wasn't it? They are, quite literally, the physical manifestation of her power. And I think this is real important. See, to me, every time Dany refers to the dragons as her children, it kind of reminds me of every time Walter White said that he was cooking meth for his family. There's a kernel of truth there, but it's not really the whole picture. What the dragons mean to her is a lot more important than the dragons themselves. Now, to be fair, this is at least due in part to the fact that Dany is a human with character and motivation, and the dragons are, well, they're animals. I mean, they're pretty smart and fucking cool animals, but they're still animals. So what the dragons mean to Dany is much more important to us, but I think that it's also much more important to her. In season 2, we get the Karth side quest. Dany is still battling with her relative lack of power, risking everything by yelling at the only people who can help, almost taking a deal that is literally too good to be true, and trying to borrow the power of a man once more. Her dragons get kidnapped.
Where are my dragons?
And she risks everything yet again to rescue them because they are her only power, and she can't allow herself to be powerless again, and she truly uses that power for the first time. Cool. She then ransacks the joint and dips out. In season 3, she heads to the city of Astapor to buy a slave army, and she trades a dragon for it. But she pulls a switcheroo, and in what is one of everyone's favorite scenes,
Dracarys.
she orders her army to kill all the slavers, i.e. everyone holding a whip. She then burns the place to the ground and walks off with this new power source, the Unsullied. Symbolically, she tosses aside the whip. 2 important things here. 1, this is her first act as a conqueror, which is important to note. 2nd, the tossing aside of the whip serves 2 purposes. Obviously, it demonstrates Daenerys' disgust with the institution of slavery, but this was already well established. She tosses aside the whip because by destroying the entire power structure of Astapor, it has been drained of its power, and the physical manifestation of that power, the Unsullied, has become hers. Are you catching on to the theme here? It's power. She then goes to neighboring Yunkai, foments a slave revolt, and then this really problematic thing happens, but hey, she earned it. In season 4, she moves on to the city of Meereen. Now I have to take a moment to point out that Meereen is fucking complicated. It's so complicated that George R. R. Martin himself has spent the last 8 years trying to write himself out of the hole he wrote himself into. Honestly, props to Dan and Dave for figuring it out at all. It's a little sloppy. Some parts of it don't make sense. The dynamic duo of Varys and Tyrion is not as fun as it was in season 2, but whatever. They actually managed to do it. So, as Dany approaches Meereen, there are 163 crucified slave children to greet her. This is both incredibly cruel and very dumb on the part of the slavers, because when Dany foments another slave revolt and takes the city, she crucifies 163 slavers in retaliation. When she hears that Astapor and Yunkai are slave cities again, she decides to hang out in Meereen for 3 seasons, in part because slavery is bad, but also because marching off to Westeros with a bunch of angry slavers at your back is, tactically speaking, a stupid fucking idea. But Dany has a problem. This isn't her. Remember that her dragons represent her power, and as her power grows, so do they. They also become harder to control because this much power in the hands of one person is dangerous. So she begins to fear her power, locking up 2 of her dragons and losing track of the other. As she shrinks away from her power, the city, both rich and poor, start to revolt against her, and she tries to borrow power from a man yet again, but that is not enough. The Sons of the Harpy almost kill her, and in that last moment she calls upon her power and the physical embodiment of it shows up to play. For the first time in the series, she fully embraces her power and rides it off into the sunset. She ends up in the Dothraki Sea, where she is taken by some Khalasar or another. Remember this bit. It's very, very important for reasons I'll get to later. In Season 6, having fully embraced her power, she burns alive the motherfuckers who kidnapped her. The rest of the Dothraki join her for reasons, and she returns to Meereen to find Tyrion done fucked up real bad, so she burns alive more motherfuckers, and having gained even more power in the form of a fleet, finally sets sail to Westeros. In Season 7, Dany finally starts losing power. When she lands on Dragonstone, the first thing she wants to do is take King's Landing. Tyrion advises against it, and when she listens to him, she loses her fleet, loses a kingdom, and gains nothing. In response, you guessed it, she burns motherfuckers. Oh, she also meets Jon Snow, and they have exactly 0 chemistry, which is only made worse by the fact that we've seen both of these characters in relationships that did have chemistry. But he does convince her to put her quest for power on hold to help fight the ice zombies, and in the course of that, she loses a dragon, which, as we've established, represents a good chunk of her power. Despite this, she remains confident. Besides, the White Walkers are kind of a big deal. Now we're at Season 8. Are you ready? No? Too bad. In Season 8, Dany sacrifices a large chunk of her army to fight the dead, though it doesn't seem to set her back that much. More importantly, she discovers that the structures of Westeros do not fit her. She doesn't belong here. All her life she has not belonged wherever she has been, and she had always longed to return to a rightful place, but it's not hers. She loses another dragon in an easily preventable situation, and when word gets out that Jon Snow, everyone's favorite mopey guy, is the rightful heir to everyone's favorite chair, she then faces the possibility of losing her home and all her power in one fell swoop. So what does she do?
Burninating the countryside, burninating the peasants, burninating all the people.
And then Jon kills her because apparently he has to, and Drogon melts his least favorite chair and flies off with Daenerys' body, which he totally ate later. You can't change my mind, the end. So, now that we're all up to speed, let's go over some of the most common complaints of the tale of Daenerys Targaryen. And who are you? The proud lord said that I must bow so low. This has to be maybe the only complaint from Season 8 where I'm just like, nope, that's wrong. I mean, there's a reason people feel this way, which I'll get to, but it was pretty heavily foreshadowed. I mean, think back on all the most memorable Daenerys moments. There was the time she calmly watched her brother get burned alive, the time she burned people alive, the time she burned people alive. the time she buried people alive, the time she burned people alive, the time she went crowd surfing, the time she summoned her dragon to burn people alive, the time she burned people alive, the time she burned people alive, the time she burned an entire army alive. You get the picture. Daenerys has always been a force for destruction, but as Tyrion points out in the final episode, it's always been righteous in some way. She's either getting revenge, or killing slavers, or defending herself, or fighting soldiers in a war. It's kind of a leap from there to genocide. I mean, this was foreshadowed, but it sure did seem sudden.
There was a bear, all black and brown and covered in hair.
Yes.
3 boys, a goat, and a dancing bear.
Seriously, I can't even mount an attempt at arguing against this complaint. The pacing of Dany's story in particular is quite jarring, since we spent 3 seasons of her sitting on a particularly uncomfortable chair, and then 2 half seasons of her conquering Westeros, most of which she's not actually doing that. I think bare minimum the last season needed to be 2 whole seasons instead of 1 half season. We could have actually had some moments to remind us of Daenerys' violent tendencies, instead of it just being like, she's just Dragon Hitler now. If the last season had just been a march down to King's Landing, we could have avoided the all-too-present jetpack problem. We could have seen how the Battle of Winterfell affected her forces. We could have got a nice tour through the 7 Kingdoms to see how everything shook out. Maybe Dany burns a small village along the way that's harboring Lannister soldiers or something. See, it could have been good. Or at least it could have made sense. And a chain and a keep are nothing compared to a woman's kiss. For hands of gold are always cold, but a woman's hands are warm. Doesn't it, though? Remember that her dragons represent her power, and she's already lost 2. She now realizes that she's never going to belong in the place that she always thought was her home, and to top it off, she has essentially lost her birthright, since Jon Snow has a much better claim to the throne than she does, and he actually belongs in Westeros. I mean, it would make more sense for her to kill him, but apparently she loves him or something? I don't know, it's hard to tell. Anyway, she clearly feels like she needs to show what happens to those who oppose her, and to show any future enemies she might have that hiding behind civilians won't work, because she will not allow anything to stand in her way. She's actually thought this through and does not revel in it. This scene is commonly misinterpreted as her snapping mentally, but it's actually her pulling herself together to commit the atrocity that she has already decided to do. But even if it does make sense, and we've had hints of this happening, and they had actually spread the story out over a proper amount of time, it would still feel wrong. Daenerys stands. Dan and Dave did you dirty.
You smelled that girl on the summer air. The bear, and the maiden fair.
So before we go on, I'm going to spoil some things in the books. Yes, I am going to tell you all about how the book was better. Won't that be fun? If you haven't read the books, I would suggest you pause this video and go read them. It's okay, they're only a combined total of 4,197 pages. We'll wait. So remember back when I said that there's a reason why Daenerys burning King's Landing feels like it comes out of nowhere, even though we know that she's willing to employ copious amounts of fiery violence in order to get her way? It's because while show Dany and book Dany are going to the same place, they're both very different characters. Now, some of these changes are not poor choices on the part of the showrunners. Remember how in season 1 Tyrion is mostly a snarky prick? He stays that way in the books. I mean, both show Tyrion and book Tyrion become more sympathetic when they become the Hand of the King, and we're on their side in the trial, but they diverge after killing Tywin and Shae. Book Tyrion descends to a whole new level of asshole, while show Tyrion only becomes more sympathetic, because by this time the audience loves him and is rooting for him. At a certain point, you almost forget that he murdered his father and lover. Jaime certainly seemed to. A similar thing happened with Cersei. See, book Cersei isn't just paranoid, she's also... How did Tywin put it?
You're not as smart as you think you are.
Remember how obviously stupid it was to appoint the High Sparrow as High Septon and arm the Faith Militant? Yeah, she spends an entire book doing stupid shit like that. But in the show, she takes on a reputation for being clever, cruel, manipulative, and most importantly, successful. We want a proper villain, and if the villain is an idiot, then we have no reason to fear and respect them. These decisions were consciously made. However, they were made in the name of streamlined storytelling. They knew that Cersei was going to be the villain and that Tyrion was going to join Daenerys and face off against her. So, making them into the characters they did, details aside, makes sense. However, what they did with Daenerys was very different. All that stuff I said earlier about how the dragons represent her power and her fear of powerlessness and how she hates being in Meereen and what being the mother of dragons and breaker of chains means to her is more important than the acts themselves. All that stuff I got from the books. I mean, it's in the show, kind of, in the first 4 seasons, but it almost feels like it was unconsciously put in there because that's what George wrote. There's one scene in particular that I think really highlights this, and it made me and my fiancé so irrationally angry when we saw it because we knew what it meant in the books. So the scene at the end of season 5 that I told you was important? In the show, the Sons of the Harpy try to assassinate her, and as a last-ditch effort, she prays to Drogon, and he shows up to rescue her, and she rides him for the first time. Like I said, this is her embracing her power for the first time after shying away from it. In the books, there's no assassination attempt. Well, there is, but it's not important. Drogon doesn't show up because he was summoned by Dany's mind powers. He shows up because he smells blood in the fighting pits, and he's a hungry boy. So, shit's on fire, everyone's freaking out, and Dany makes the first bold move that she's made in 1,000 pages. She gets up, marches down to the fighting pit, picks up a whip that was dropped by a fighter or something, and starts whipping the shit out of Drogon. Remember how she very visibly cast aside that whip in season 3? Yeah, this moment was important. And when she rides him off into the sunset, it's more akin to a bull ride at a rodeo than the please may I climb aboard scenario that was in the show. Drogon does not submit to her. She conquers him. She takes her power back. And when the Dothraki find her, she's in burnt, tattered clothing, and her and Drogon are just mowing down on a freshly killed horse. It's a very different series of events, and given where she ends up, I'd say it's fucking essential. And there's all kinds of changes like this. In the books, she hates sitting in Meereen, and her relationship with Daario, a sex and death-obsessed mercenary, is clearly an outlet for this. She's essentially trapped there since Astapor, Yunkai, and Karth all have the city blockaded, and she could burn them all, but she's trying not to be her father, and it's driving her mad. She is clearly shit at ruling. Contrast this with the show, where Dany's decision to remain in Meereen is a moral one. She is very much motivated by ending slavery. Daario is a lovable rogue, and Drogon automatically submits to her. She is shown to go to extreme measures, but is ultimately a pretty good ruler. This whole thing?
Lannister, Targaryen, Baratheon, Stark, Tyrell. They're all just spokes on a wheel. This one's on top, then that one's on top, and on it spins, crushing those on the ground.
It's a beautiful dream. Stopping the wheel. You're not the first person who's ever dreamt it.
I'm not going to stop the wheel. I'm going to break the wheel.
That shit is in no way in the books. She overturns the system in Slaver's Bay to access the untapped political power of the slaves there. She has no intention of overturning the system in Westeros. She just wants to be on top of it. Which is something that was made apparent in the show in the last episode, but it feels cheap and mean because it's not what we were promised. Dan and Dave knew where this was going, and they tried to have it both ways by giving indications that she was both benevolent and cruel. But the problem with that is that we loved her. We rooted for her. Without being given strong indications one way or the other, like with what happened in the fighting pits in the books, we saw her actions as cruel means to serve benevolent ends instead of benevolent means to serve cruel ends. And not only that, but she really had become a bit of a pop feminist icon. And they knew that too, because they leaned into that shit when they had her final coalition be the Sand Snakes, Yara Greyjoy, and the most badass of all, Lady Olenna. I mean, woman, I am not. But even I thought that was some empowering shit. So to pull the rug out from under Daenerys fans like this not only stank of subversion for subversion's sake, but there are people who quite rightly felt like their very identities were being trampled on with that shit. This is not what we were promised. And with a cry of savage rage, they swarmed across the rill. So, like I said, I actually kinda liked the final season. I think we can all agree episode 2 was by far the best, and that Miguel Sapochnik can direct the shit out of anything he is given, and I can't wait until this guy runs a show of his own or starts directing movies. I am fucking there. Episode 3 was good, and so was Arya killing the Night King. You guys are just big, whiny babies. Theon had the most satisfying character arc of anyone. Clegane Bowl didn't live up to the hype, but we all knew it wouldn't, and that was the whole point of the get hype meme, right? Jaime and Brienne's relationship would have been perfect if they just didn't bang, because that knighting ceremony was significantly more intimate than almost anything in the whole show. I really like the idea of the Three-Eyed Raven being king, because he can pass the whole weirwood net thing on to the next king, which is cool. The final shot of the small council doing their job, and the shot of Jon riding north and looking back at the wall, knowing that he's totally abandoning the Watch and never returning to Westeros, brought a lump to my throat. It made me really nostalgic for when this show was unimpeachably good, and made me realize that I'm gonna miss it, regardless of how the last few seasons were. Also, while I'm a big fan of the Cosmonaut Variety Hour, Marcus's video on Game of Thrones was bad. Not because he's wrong, per se, but because if you've ever spent any amount of time on the A Song of Ice and Fire subreddit, Asoyaf, you'll know that he basically just copy-pasted his complaints from there. Asoyaf is where book readers go to hate the show, and he basically got all of his complaints from it. Especially the part where he calls the show fan fiction and acts like this very niche, angry view is broadly accepted. It's not. It never is. Yes, now the rains weep o'er his halls, and not a soul to hear. No, I honestly, I can't even pretend to have to think about that. It was bad. Honestly, the whole season was so horribly rushed, and I think Daenerys may have been the worst casualty of them all. Sorry, I know I'm supposed to defend things that suck in this series, but sometimes they just actually suck. I will say that I had fun, though. I mean, it wasn't good, but I had fun. But anyway, that's enough about TV. It's time to get back to the politics. So, like if you like this, subscribe if you want to see more, support me on Patreon if you got a couple copper crowns you can throw my way, and share if you know a Daenerys fan who's still really upset. Alright, now I'm going to go make some dinner. It's sort of a steak and sweet potato thing. Well, I don't really care for sweet potatoes, but I'm going to try it anyway. No, 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 no. Hey guys, sort of last minute decision I made after recording that Hands of Gold song, that I throw it up on Patreon for my patrons. So if you want that song, go ahead and support me on Patreon. No one's done that yet, so hey, you could be the first. Or if not, just watch my video a bunch. That works for me too.